Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the Mrs. Mummy PhD podcast. I am your host, Michelle Gibbs, and I am passionate about helping scholarly mamas like you navigate your journeys with purpose so you can achieve your life and academic goals without sacrificing what matters. The reality is that scholarly mama life is multidimensional. We're scholars, yes, but we're also mothers, wives, and so much more with whole lives outside of academia. So how do we successfully navigate all this? Well, first, we need the space to embrace this unique blend. Only then can we begin the important work of becoming purposefully whole. And part of my own purposeful work is to create a space for us as scholarly mamas to grow, to reflect, and to become everything that we were meant to be. So, mama, are you in? Fabulous. Let's begin. These are our journeys of becoming. Hello, 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 mamas. Welcome back to this very exciting episode of the Mrs. Mummy PhD podcast. I am so happy that you've chosen to tune in today because in today's episode, it's going to be all about my Viva. So if you're following me on Instagram, you would have seen that last week I successfully defended my PhD thesis by Viva. Now, I'm in the UK, which means that that's how we examine PhD theses in the UK. You have an oral Viva. And I had mine last week, and thankfully it was a huge success. And I am just so overwhelmed with gratitude and joy and relief and just pure happiness that this phase of my journey is now more or less over. I'm still waiting for all of the official processes to be completed so that I can officially say that I am completely finished and I've got my PhD. But yeah, I am just super thrilled and super grateful for the opportunity. And so I posted on Instagram in my stories a question, which was whether you wanted me to talk about my experience of my Viva and share any top tips, and an overwhelming number of you said yes. And so that's kind of what I'm going to focus on in this episode. I'm going to talk a lot about my experience in my Viva and also share, my top takeaways for those of you who may be approaching your Viva or just thinking ahead if you're not at that stage of your PhD journey as yet. So if you are preparing to submit your thesis, I actually shared in another episode my raw reactions after I submitted my thesis back in May of 2023. And in that episode, I talk a lot about my journey to completing my thesis, how long it took me, and just the feeling of finally submitting my thesis. So if you haven't listened to that episode, please be sure to tune into that one. So in this episode, we'll focus more on the actual Viva. So what I'll do, just, to avoid making this episode too long, I will split this into two parts. The first, I will talk about my preparation for my Viva. And the second, I will share my experience of the actual Viva itself and then how I felt afterwards, and just kind of bring everything together and summarize my top tips. So in this episode, we'll just focus on the actual preparation phase, and then I'll talk about the actual Viva itself in the next episode. So I submitted my thesis back in May of 2023, and that was a huge accomplishment, yes, but obviously I still knew that the Viva was the next big hurdle to tackle. And my thesis was very big. It's 100,000 words, and with the appendices and everything, it's over 600 pages, so it's huge. And because of that, I knew that I needed to really give myself time to prepare for my Viva well, and to ensure that I was going into that Viva fully prepared and fully confident. So at the beginning of August, I actually set out a timetable for myself. obviously the kids were going to be off school. So like I mentioned in one of my Instagram posts, it was juggle struggle on steroids because I had to prepare for my Viva. The kids are off school on summer holidays. You know, there's all the back to school shopping, which I literally only finished yesterday. So there was all of that and lots of laundry, lots of ironing. You know, when the kids are home, the house is usually a mess. So there's that. Yeah, there was just a lot to juggle. So because of that, I knew that I needed to be very strategic about my preparation for my Viva. I did make some really bold moves at the beginning of the summer, which I'll talk about in another episode. But for the Viva, I worked out that I wanted to give myself a whole month to prepare for the Viva. I know some people share that, you know, you could just prepare for the Viva a couple days in advance, but I gave myself an entire month because of the size of my thesis, because I also had to juggle home life as well with the kids at home, and I also wanted to do fun things with them, and we went to Legoland and did lots of other fun activities. And I didn't want that the summer was just, especially with them being off school, that I was just mummy preparing for her Viva. I wanted them to still enjoy their summer, so I gave myself an entire month. So at the end of July, I worked out a schedule for August. Within that time, I allocated certain days in the week for complete Viva prep, where I could immerse myself in my reading and preparation for the Viva. And then I also blocked out the weekends to spend with my family and do things with them. My husband had some time off work towards the very end. So, you know, that week before my Viva, he was off so that I could purely focus on that. And I thankfully didn't have work to worry about during this time either. And so that really helped. So I was able to do what bits I could during the day and then, you know, still have time to spend with my family and do things with them. So at the beginning of August, I literally wrote out a schedule, allocated certain dates to my PhD, and that plan worked really, really well. Obviously, on the days where my husband wasn't at home and I was just with the boys, I didn't really get much done in terms of PhD. So that was more in the evenings. So all of this was documented in my schedule. So pre-Viva was obviously all about preparation. And my thesis is a beast. It's humongous. And so I knew I needed to give myself sufficient time. And so what I did is when I allocated those days for PhD Viva prep, I broke my thesis down by chapter and I allocated a certain number of days per chapter. So the aim was that I wanted to read my thesis twice, which is a huge, huge undertaking because it's so big. But I wanted to read it twice. And so I broke it down by chapter and I allocated days for each chapter. Now, for the first reading of my thesis, I just read. I didn't do any extra reading. I didn't go off and reread references. I didn't do anything like that. I just read it, because I wanted to just remind myself of the major arguments I was making, the main influences on my thoughts, the main authors I've cited, but just from a kind of mental simulation point of view. So I just wanted to refamiliarize myself with the thesis in detail. So that was the first reading. Again, that was by chapter. So I broke down each chapter into sections, allocated which sections and from which chapters I was going to read on which days. And I read those without stopping, just reading. Then once I'd read through the thesis once, I then broke that down again for the second reading. But this time for the second reading, I'm reading the thesis. I'm reading my notes, very detailed notes. I'm reading papers again. I'm reminding myself of details in notes, papers, and the thesis and jotting down like main points. So I find personally that the act of writing things out really helps me to commit them to memory. And so I was writing main points out. I was writing main arguments out. I was writing main defense points out. So if I had to defend a particular decision that I made during my PhD, I would write that out. So I had all these notes, I had all these papers, I had all of the actual thesis. But one of the points I should make here actually is that I'd printed a version of my thesis. So I have the digital version, but I found that that's fine, but I found it was a lot easier for me to read a printed version so that I can jot notes down in the margins and highlight things and that sort of thing. So I printed before I actually started my preparation. I'd printed a version of my thesis for preparation for the Viva. So that's one thing to consider if you are, when you're preparing for your Viva, to print a version of your thesis. In hindsight, I probably wish I'd printed maybe 2 pages per page or even 4 pages per page, but I actually printed it just 1 page per page. So it was a very, very thick document. But the whole idea is to really familiarize yourself with your thesis. Know it absolutely inside out. And I think that by printing it and by having those 2 readings, that really helped me to just feel confident in finding tables quickly, chapters quickly, references quickly, particular sections quickly if I needed to. So I read my thesis twice. The first time without any kind of extra input, just reading. The second time actually writing notes and rereading key references and making sure that I am familiar again with the rationale behind why I chose those references and also the main arguments that I was trying to make in my thesis. So that's what I did. So by the time I got to a couple of days before my thesis, I had read my thesis twice and I had all my notes, obviously, and I felt pretty confident. But one of the other things I did before my Viva was that I had a mock Viva with my primary supervisor, which I thought was really, really helpful. So at this point, I'd already read my thesis and I was reading it again. So this was like a week before my Viva. So I was reading it again at that point. And I had this mock Viva with him. And it was really nice the way we did it because we kind of split it in 2 parts. So we had the first half of the mock Viva where I was asked questions and had to come up with answers in response. And that was really helpful because I kind of got a feel for how it feels to not just know how to answer the question, but how to articulate the answer out loud to someone. And I found that was really helpful. And what it also did make me realize is that I needed succinct ways of answering questions. So even though I knew the answers to the questions, because I hadn't at that point practiced verbally articulating them, it was really helpful to do that. It was really helpful to practice saying these things out loud to someone. And so that's what we did. And then in the second half of the mock Viva, which was a couple hours after the first half, we kind of practiced saying these things a bit more succinctly. And so that was really helpful as well. So I don't know whether you've got that option, but if you do, it's worth having that. And it doesn't have to be a couple hours apart. It could be a couple days apart or even a week apart, but just having a first go at it and then almost having a second opportunity to do it better, but slightly different questions or slightly tweaked questions, but an opportunity to practice actually articulate an answer in a succinct way. So that was really helpful for me. After my mock Viva, I then realized I needed to do more practice with the succinct articulation. And so I got some mock Viva questions, which I found online. I will try and leave a link to that in the show notes. But I literally stood in front of my mirror and practiced answering those questions out loud, like literally out loud. I tried also on my husband. I got him to listen to some of my answers as well, which I'm sure he found so much fun. But yeah, so do practice answering questions, because it's one thing to know the information You've spent a lot of time on your thesis, you know your stuff, but it's worth verbalizing it, in answer to a particular question, because you then find sometimes that you ramble a little bit and before you actually get to the point. So if you practice those questions in advance, then when you actually come across them in your Viva, like literally your brain will just immediately go back to your experience of succinctly communicating your answers, which will be really helpful for you. You can't practice all the questions. You don't know what questions are going to come up in your Viva. A lot of the questions that I did practice didn't come up in my Viva, but other questions I didn't practice did come up. But I think the fact that I was at a place of, I felt very prepared and I knew my thesis, I knew my work inside out, I felt able to, and because I'd had that practice of succinct articulation, I was able to deliver the answers in a very, very professional and well articulated way. So that was the Viva prep. Obviously, that went up all the way until the night before my Viva. And this is another point. So one of the things I did was not only was I preparing for the actual Viva and being able to answer questions, but I also had thoughts about how I was going to set up for the Viva, because I wanted to make sure that I set up in a way that was comfortable for me, that I felt confident and comfortable with, and also that I could access my thesis and my notes if I needed to. And so I set myself up. I had set myself up at our dining table. I had everything spread out on the table. I actually had 2 laptops. So one laptop I used for the actual Viva, virtual Viva, and the other laptop I had I had a digital version of my thesis there. But of course, I also had the printed version as well. In the actual Viva, I didn't actually refer to the digital version of my thesis. I just used the physical version, but I wanted it there just in case. And also I had my notes and things. What I did do, even though I printed a version of my thesis, I also printed a couple of my tables and figures on separate sheets because they were really complex and I wanted a way of quickly being able to just refer to them without having to look for them in the thesis. So that's something worth considering. I didn't print all of them, but just the key ones, and that was really helpful. So that's all the preparation. And then I set the room up. I literally blocked it off from the boys. I'm like, you're not allowed to go at this dining table. Do not touch anything. Everything is all set up. But I did this actually the night before when they'd actually gone up for bed. So it was only that morning of the Viva that I had to make sure our toddler didn't go and scatter all of my papers everywhere, because that would not have been good. But anyway, so everything was set up the night before. So, Mama, I'm going to pause there and I will continue this conversation in the next episode, part 2 of this episode, all about nailing your PhD Viva with a purposeful scholarly mama strategy. So we'll just stop here for today, and next week we can continue the conversation and talk about the actual Viva and how that went for me, and then go over my top takeaway tips for how to nail your PhD Viva. So that's it for now, Mama. I'm sending you lots of love and lots of gratitude. See you in the next episode. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Mrs. Mummy PhD podcast. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and if you did and you want in on this movement, why not head over to mrsmummyphd.com. You can join the waitlist for our exclusive community of smart, purposeful, scholarly mamas. We'd love to see you on the inside. Remember, Mama, these are our journeys of becoming.